July 23, 1944, Normandy, France. The Norman hedgerow explodes in a fountain of dirt and metal. Oberstleutnant Heinrich Vogel feels the impact before he hears it, a white-hot lance through his thigh that steals his breath and dumps him sideways into mud that smells of cordite and torn earth. His vision narrows to a tunnel. The summer sky, impossibly blue moments ago, fades to gray. Blood pulses from his leg in rhythmic spurts that match his hammering heart, each beat carrying his life into French soil that has already drunk too much German blood. His men are shouting. Their voices reach him through cotton, muffled and distant. Hands grab at him, rough, panicked hands that drag him backward through the shattered bocage. The tourniquet bites into his flesh, a different kind of agony that barely registers against the draining cold spreading through his chest. Heinrich Vogel, who commanded a panzer battalion through 3 years of war, who survived the Russian winter and the African desert, is dying in a ditch in France because American artillery found his position with terrifying precision. He had expected to die eventually. Every officer who survived past 1942 carried that knowledge like a stone in his pocket. But he had not expected it to feel like this, like drowning in air, like watching the world recede down a long corridor, while his body becomes something distant and unresponsive. His soldiers are still dragging him, still shouting, but their retreat is cut off. The Americans are everywhere suddenly, olive uniforms materializing from the smoke like ghosts made solid. The shooting stops. Vogel's men drop their weapons, hands rising skyward, voices cracking as they try to form English words that will save their commander's life. Arzt, doctor, bitte, please. They gesture frantically at the spreading pool beneath Vogel's leg, at the tourniquet that has already failed once and been retied with shaking fingers. Vogel's consciousness flickers like a candle in wind. He has lost nearly 3 pints. His femoral artery, severed by shrapnel, has turned his leg into a pump, draining his life. Minutes remain before his heart gives out entirely. He thinks of his mother in Hamburg, who will receive a telegram months from now if the Reich bothers to send one. He thinks of the letter he never finished, still folded in his tunic pocket. He thinks nothing at all. An American face appears above him, angular, focused, young but weathered. Captain James Morrison, field surgeon, kneels in the mud without hesitation, his hands already moving across Vogel's body with professional efficiency. The German officer's pulse is thready, his skin chalk white, his lips blue. Morrison has seen this death before, has watched it claim men faster than morphine could ease their passing. Standard plasma will not work fast enough. Whole blood is the only answer, and they have none. Morrison checks the dog tags, reads the blood type stamped into metal. Type A. His own type. The coincidence that will define both their lives settles over him with the weight of fate. Prepare for direct transfusion, Morrison says. His medics stare. Sergeant Walsh, who has followed Morrison through Sicily and Salerno and Utah Beach, actually steps forward. Captain, we've got an offensive in 2 hours. You can't... Now, Sergeant. Morrison is already rolling up his sleeve. The procedure is dangerous even in hospital settings. Infection, incompatibility reactions, the simple fact that giving blood weakens you for hours afterward. They are in a combat zone. Mortars are still landing 300 yards away. The hedgerow position could be counterattacked at any moment. Every military consideration says to let the enemy officer die and conserve their surgeon's strength for American casualties. Morrison's hands do not shake as he lies down beside the German. The needle slides into his vein with practiced ease. His blood, oxygenated and warm, begins its journey into the body of a man who was trying to kill Americans an hour ago. For 20 minutes, they lie there in the mud while the war continues around them. Vogel's medics hover nearby, disarmed but unable to look away. American soldiers establish a perimeter, glancing back repeatedly at the bizarre tableau, their surgeon and an enemy officer connected by tubing, blood flowing between enemies while smoke drifts across the battlefield. Morrison watches the German's face. Color returns first to the lips, then the cheeks. The pulse strengthens beneath his fingers. Consciousness flickers back like a light behind frosted glass. Vogel's eyelids flutter. His gaze focuses slowly on Morrison's face, on the tubing running between their arms, on the impossible fact of his continued existence. Understanding comes gradually. An American surgeon is giving his own blood. Not plasma from stores, but actual blood from his body. The propaganda Heinrich Vogel absorbed for a decade promised barbarism from the Americans, revenge for Pearl Harbor, Jewish-controlled savagery, racial inferiors incapable of mercy. Instead, this angular-faced captain has tethered his life to an enemy's, has made himself vulnerable and weak to preserve a German officer who will give him nothing in return except perhaps intelligence under interrogation, which honor forbids anyway. The contradiction is total. Vogel's entire understanding of the war, of the enemy, of what this fight means, cracks like ice under sudden weight. Morrison removes the needle with the same efficiency he applied it. He sits up slowly, light-headed but functional. Vogel is stable now, no longer circling the drain. The German tries to speak, but Morrison shakes his head. Save your strength. His tone is professional, neutral, neither warm nor cold, just a doctor finishing his work. They carry Vogel to a field hospital on a stretcher that smells of other men's blood. Morrison watches him go, then stands, tests his balance, and returns to his duties. An offensive is coming. American boys will need his hand steady, his mind clear. He has made himself weaker to save an enemy, and now he must be strong enough to save his friends. The gamble pays off. Morrison performs 3 surgeries that evening, his hand steady despite the blood loss. The offensive succeeds. Life continues its forward march through summer mud and German steel. For Heinrich Vogel, time moves differently now. The field hospital becomes a POW processing center, which becomes a camp in England, which becomes a transport ship to America, which becomes a prison camp in Kansas, where German officers work in factories and wait for a war to end that has already ended for them personally. Months pass. Seasons change. The invasion becomes liberation, becomes occupation, becomes victory. Vogel works in a machine shop, learns better English, reads American newspapers that describe a war he experienced from the losing side. At night in the barracks, he lies awake and tries to reconcile what he was taught with what he knows. German propaganda had prepared him for many things. It explained why Germany fought, why sacrifice was necessary, why the enemy deserved no mercy and would show none in return. Every aspect of Nazi ideology depended on dehumanizing opponents, on treating the war as an existential struggle between incompatible peoples who could only coexist through one side's complete destruction. Captain Morrison's blood, flowing into Vogel's body while mortars crashed nearby, demolished that entire architecture of belief. Vogel was not naive. He had seen atrocities, had heard rumors from the Eastern Front that turned his stomach, had felt the regime's brutality even within its own ranks. But he had maintained a kind of compartmentalization, telling himself that his duty was to his men, that honor existed in the military sphere, even if politics were corrupt, that a soldier could remain decent within an indecent system. Morrison showed him something different. Not honor bounded by nationality or ideology, but honor as an absolute, the kind that sees a human being first, enemy second, and responds accordingly regardless of strategic advantage. Morrison risked infection, weakness, and his own survival for no tactical gain whatsoever. He did it because a man was dying and he could stop it. And that simple calculus outweighed everything else. The other prisoners noticed Vogel's silence. He was always quiet, always controlled. But now there is a weight to his silence that suggests constant internal argument. He reads voraciously. American books, German books sent by the Red Cross. Anything that might help him understand what his life means now that its foundation has crumbled. The war ends. Germany surrenders unconditionally. The camps continue, but the atmosphere changes. Less prison, more waiting room for men whose country no longer exists in the form they knew. Repatriation begins slowly, prioritizing those with families, those with skills needed for reconstruction. Vogel returns to Germany in 1946. Hamburg is rubble. His mother survived in a basement that became her world for 3 years. His sister married an SS officer who disappeared into Soviet captivity. His brother died at Stalingrad. The city where he grew up is gone, replaced by a moonscape of broken masonry and hollow-eyed survivors. He rebuilds. There is no other choice. Men who fought for the Reich are not celebrated here. They are simply absorbed back into a population too exhausted for judgment. Vogel finds work, first as a laborer, then as a foreman, eventually starting a small logistics company, moving goods through the shattered infrastructure. The Marshall Plan brings resources, brings hope, brings the slow possibility that life might mean more than mere survival. He marries Anna in 1948. She lost her first fiancé to the Eastern Front, her parents to Allied bombing, her faith in anything larger than the small kindnesses between individuals. They build a life together quietly, without grand aspirations, focusing on the tangible, a clean apartment, enough food, children who might grow up without war. The memory of Morrison never fades. If anything, it grows sharper as Vogel's life stabilizes. Success brings leisure, and leisure brings reflection. He begins to understand that Morrison's transfusion saved more than his physical life. It provided a thread he could follow out of the ideological maze that had defined his youth. Every time Vogel treats an employee fairly, every time he helps a competitor in difficulty, every time he chooses decency over advantage, he is following the example set by an American surgeon in Norman mud. Tracking Morrison down takes years. The Red Cross helps, as do letters to various American military archives. The bureaucracy of peace is sometimes more impenetrable than the chaos of war. But Vogel is patient. He has learned patience. The letter arrives in 1952. Captain James Morrison, discharged with honors, has returned to civilian practice in Cincinnati, Ohio. He married his childhood sweetheart. He has 3 children. He specializes in thoracic surgery. He does not talk much about the war. Vogel's first letter is formal, careful. He explains who he is, recalls the circumstances of their meeting, expresses gratitude that feels inadequate to the enormity of the gift. He expects no response. After all, Morrison gave his blood without asking for thanks, without creating obligation. A man who acts from pure principle might prefer that the incident remain buried in history. Morrison's reply arrives 6 weeks later. It is brief, characteristically understated. He remembers. He is glad Vogel survived. He hopes Germany's reconstruction proceeds well. He does not want gratitude because he was simply doing his job. The war is over. Let it stay over. But Vogel cannot let it stay over, not in the sense Morrison means. The war ended, but its lessons continue. Morrison taught him what honor truly means, not the performative honor of uniforms and medals, but the difficult honor of seeing clearly and acting rightly, even when no one is watching, even when it costs you, even when the person you help is your enemy. Vogel begins sending money, small amounts at first, directed toward Morrison's children's education fund. Morrison sends them back. Vogel sends them again, this time through a third party. making them impossible to refuse without causing more trouble than accepting them. It becomes a quiet battle of wills, both men stubborn, both principled, neither willing to yield. Eventually, Morrison accepts, not because he needs the money, his practice is successful, but because he recognizes that Vogel needs to give it. The German officer is trying to repay an unpayable debt, not out of obligation, but out of a desire to participate in the same circle of generosity that saved him. Morrison understands that impulse. He lets Vogel give. Their correspondence continues for years. The letters are never frequent, 3 or 4 per year. Brief updates on children's progress, business developments, health concerns. They do not discuss the war much. There is no need. The transfusion said everything that needed saying. In 1963, Morrison's eldest daughter receives a full scholarship to study medicine at the University of Cincinnati. The scholarship is funded by an anonymous German benefactor. She will never know that the money came from a man whose life was saved by her father's blood in a Norman hedgerow 19 years earlier, that her education represents a circle completing itself across former battle lines. Vogel's business succeeds beyond his modest hopes. Post-war Germany, rebuilt with American aid and German discipline, becomes an economic engine. His logistics company expands, opens offices in Frankfurt and Munich, employs over 200 people. He runs it with principles learned from both positive and negative examples, treating workers with dignity, paying fairly, competing honestly. When asked about his management philosophy, he often quotes an American proverb, "Do unto others." He never explains where he learned it. Morrison's children grow, marry, scatter across America, pursuing their own lives. His practice continues. He becomes known for difficult cases, for staying calm under pressure, for the kind of steady competence that saves lives without drama. He never tells his children about Vogel. The war is a closed chapter, something he survived and left behind. But Anna knows. Vogel tells her the full story on their 10th anniversary, when the wine has loosened his tongue and the children are asleep. He explains about the hedgerow, the blood, the American surgeon who chose healing over hatred. He explains that everything good in his life flows from that moment, not just his survival, but his understanding of what it means to be decent in an indecent world. Anna listens. She takes his hand. "You would have done the same," she says. "No," Vogel replies. "Not then. I was too full of propaganda, too convinced that the enemy was something less than human. Morrison showed me I was wrong. He treated me as a patient first, enemy second. I had the order reversed for 26 years. The 1960s pass. The 70s arrive. Germany reunifies in spirit before politics catches up. The generation that fought the war begins to age, to fade, to carry their memories toward the grave. Vogel attends veterans' meetings sometimes, listens to old men refight old battles, notices how few of them talk about what the war taught them versus what they did in the war. He stays silent mostly. His lesson from the war is too personal, too complicated, to share with men still sorting through their own contradictions. Morrison retires in 1976. His practice is taken over by younger doctors who admire his steady hands and steadier ethics. He moves to a smaller house, tends a garden, spoils grandchildren, lives the quiet life he always preferred. The war is 50 years past now, ancient history to everyone except those who lived it. Vogel's last letter to Morrison arrives in 1979. It is longer than usual, less formal, written by a man who knows his time is running out. Colon cancer, inoperable, months remaining. He wants Morrison to know that the transfusion saved more than his life. It saved his soul. Without Morrison's example, Vogel writes, he might have spent his remaining years bitter, broken, trapped in the ideology that devoured his youth. Instead, he built something decent. He raised good children. He treated people with the dignity Morrison showed him in that hedgerow when every military consideration said to let him die. "You taught me what honor means," Vogel writes, "not the honor of flags and anthems, which is easy, but the honor of seeing another human being when everything in your culture tells you to see an enemy. That is hard honor, true honor. You saved my life twice. Once with your blood, once with your example. Thank you. Morrison receives the letter in November. He reads it 3 times, then walks into his garden and sits among the dying autumn flowers. He thinks about that day in Normandy, the mud, the blood, the impossible decision that felt like no decision at all because a man was dying and he could stop it. He never considered it remarkable. He took an oath. The oath did not include exceptions for nationality. But Vogel's letter suggests the moment meant more than Morrison realized. Not just for Vogel personally, but as a repudiation of everything the war represented. Total war demands total dehumanization. You cannot kill millions unless you first convince yourself they are less than human. Morrison's transfusion was a small act of resistance against that dehumanization, an insistence on seeing the human even in the enemy. He writes back. The letter is characteristically brief. He is sorry about Vogel's illness. He is glad they corresponded. He was just doing his job. But if that job helped Vogel find his way to a decent life, then Morrison is grateful for the opportunity. Sometimes, he writes, we influence each other in ways we never expect. The war threw them together for 20 minutes. What happened afterward, Vogel's transformation, his business, his family, his insistence on treating people with dignity, that was Vogel's own doing. Morrison just gave blood. Vogel gave himself a second chance. Vogel dies in January 1980. His funeral is large. Employees, competitors, friends, family, all gathering to honor a man who built something honest from ruins. The eulogy mentions his military service only briefly, focusing instead on his business ethics, his generosity, his quiet strength. Anna finds Morrison's letter in Heinrich's desk afterward, carefully preserved alongside other important documents. She understands then that her husband carried 2 lives, the one he lived and the one he might have lived without that transfusion. Morrison learns of Vogel's death through an obituary sent by Anna. He attends no funeral. The distance is too far, the connection too private. But he plants a tree in his garden that spring, an oak sapling that will outlive him by decades. He does not explain to his wife why this particular tree matters. She knows enough not to ask. The oak grows. Decades pass. The 20th century becomes the 21st. The men who fought the Second World War dwindle toward extinction, taking their memories with them. History becomes something read in books rather than lived in flesh. But the story of a Norman hedgerow on July 23, 1944, survives because it captures something essential about what it means to be human in inhuman circumstances. 2 men, enemies by every measure that mattered to their governments, connected by blood and choice. One risked everything to save the other. The other built a life worthy of that sacrifice. Morrison's oak still stands in Cincinnati. Vogel's company still operates in Hamburg, now run by his grandchildren, who never knew the war but carry forward his principles. The blood that flowed between enemies in Normandy continues its work decades later, translated into lives lived decently, into choices made with conscience, into the quiet insistence that humanity matters more than hatred. The hedgerows of Normandy have long since healed, the scars of battle covered by summer grass. The men who fought there are mostly gone. But the lesson remains, written in blood and mud, and the stubborn courage of individuals who refuse to let war turn them into something less than human. Captain James Morrison gave 20 minutes of his blood to an enemy. Oberstleutnant Heinrich Vogel spent 35 years repaying that gift by treating every person he met as Morrison treated him, as a human being first, everything else second. The transfusion lasted 20 minutes. Its effects lasted lifetimes. This is what war cannot kill. The individual choice to see clearly, to act rightly, to insist on decency, even when every external force demands brutality. Morrison made that choice in a moment of crisis. Vogel honored it for the rest of his life. Together, they proved that even in humanity's darkest hours, when nations mobilize millions to kill millions, individual choices still matter. The blood has long since been replaced cell by cell through normal biological processes. Morrison's blood no longer flows in anyone's veins. But its metaphorical presence remains in Vogel's children and grandchildren, in the employees he treated fairly, in the competitors he helped, in every person whose life was touched by a man who learned honor from an enemy who refused to be an enemy when it mattered most. July 23, 1944. A hedgerow in Normandy. 20 minutes that bridged an unbridgeable divide. Two men who became more than their uniforms, their nations, their war. One transfusion that saved a life and transformed it. The rest is silence and memory, and the quiet triumph of choosing humanity when the world insists on hatred.